The hand reached for it before the eyes were open. Gideon Hale had not noticed when the habit formed. He only knew that his right hand moved toward the porch railing every morning the way it moved toward the coffee cup, without instruction, without thought, before the cold had fully entered him. He opened the back door at 4:50 in the morning, the way he had opened it for 12 years, and his hand swung out in the dark and found nothing. He stood in the doorway. The cold came in past him and moved through the kitchen. He did not close the door. He looked at the railing, bare boards, frost along the grain, the sky above the yard still the color of iron. He looked for a long moment in the way of a man who has made an arithmetic error and is running the numbers again, certain he has missed something. He had not missed anything. The railing was bare. He closed the door, made coffee, sat at the table where he always sat, and the chair he always used, with his back to the window and the empty chair across from him. He drank the coffee slowly. When it was gone, he made more. He was not hungry. He sat with that fact longer than was comfortable before he understood it. He had not been hungry on a winter morning in 3 years, because there had always been bread. He did not know who left it. He had never asked. It arrived. That was the whole of what he had made of it. Wrapped in cloth in the warm months, unwrapped and still faintly warm from the oven in the cold ones. Dark bread in January, lighter in October. Once with dried rosemary pressed into the top that he had eaten down to the last hard corner without remarking on it to anyone, because there was no one to remark to. He rode to town at noon. The postmaster, Ben Holt, was sorting the morning freight when Gideon came through the door. They exchanged the usual words about weather and road conditions. Then Gideon said, with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed the question 3 times on the ride over, "Who's out at the Pendleton place these days?" Ben looked up. "Calloway woman. Ruth Calloway, widow. Been there 3 winters, give or take. She's still there. Took work over in Harlan. Starts Monday, I hear. Boards through the week." Ben set down an envelope. "Something you need out that way?" "No," Gideon said. "Just wondering." He rode home past the Pendleton gate at the usual pace, the same pace he had ridden past it every week for 3 years without stopping. The gate was weathered wood, the hinge dark with age. Nothing about it had changed. He had simply never looked at it before. He unsaddled his horse in the dark barn and stood there a moment in the smell of hay and cold leather, his hands at his sides. A man can ride the same road 1,000 times and never once see where it goes. He had been riding it blind. The railing had a groove in it. He found it the next morning, not looking for it, just setting his palm flat on the wood the way he sometimes did when he first stepped out, feeling the temperature of the day before he fully entered it. The groove was on the near edge of the top board, worn smooth where the grain had been worked flat by something set down and lifted over a long and patient repetition. He crouched and looked at it in the early light. The smoothness had no rough edges. Whatever had worn it had done so gently, with weight and consistency for a very long time. He had never looked at his own porch railing before. He went back inside and stood at the kitchen counter and began, against his will, to remember. He was not a man who examined his days as a habit. He worked, ate, slept, rose, worked again. The bread had arrived as part of the background of his life the way the sound of the creek arrived, present, reliable, not remarkable. But now he was looking directly at it, and what he saw was a catalog that shamed him. Summer, cloth wrapped, the knot tied with a precision that meant someone had done it carefully. Autumn, the rosemary loaves, twice maybe, 3 times. And once a small jar of preserved plum that he had eaten with a spoon over the sink, like a man who has forgotten what a table is for. Winter, the dense dark bread, Monday without exception, still holding the ghost of warmth when he found it before first light. He counted. 3 winters, each with its Mondays. He stopped counting when the number became specific enough to feel like an accusation. At the feed stall that afternoon, Marin Price was behind the counter writing in the order book when he came in for fence wire. She was a practical woman who had lived in this county her whole life and knew the business of everyone in it without being unkind about it. She mentioned Ruth Calloway without Gideon asking, mentioned it the way women like Marin mention things they consider a person ought to know. Practical woman, Marin said, not looking up from the book. Gave up waiting on things, not going to change. Gideon set money on the counter. She give any reason for leaving? Marin looked at him then, with the patience of a woman who has explained something to a rock before and knows the rock's limitations. Some reasons don't need saying out loud, Mr. Hale. He rode home in the flat gray afternoon. He sat at his table and did not light the lamp for a long time. 156 Mondays, roughly. That was what 3 winters of Mondays produced. He had been present for every one of them. He had eaten the bread and risen and worked and been, by all external measures, a decent man. You don't miss the water till the creek runs dry, and by then the thirst has already changed you. He was beginning to understand what kind of thirst he had been carrying. He opened the Bible that night, not for faith, but for fact. It sat on the shelf where it had always sat, the spine worn at the top from years of being taken down and put back. He opened to the first page, where names were written in ink that had browned with time. Della Hale in her own hand, the letters careful and upright. Below hers and his, unnamed, born and passed, March 1867, 2 lines, the whole of what he had been unable to move past for 9 years, written in 30 characters. He set the Bible on the table and left it open and looked at it the way you look at something you have been avoiding looking at directly. Della had died in the cold of early spring, and the child with her, and Gideon had done what a man does in that country, in that time. He kept working. He built his grief into the fence lines and the early mornings and the discipline of needing nothing from anyone. The ranch ran, the seasons turned. He became, to every eye in the county, a reliable man, steady, quiet, self-sufficient. He brought no trouble to his neighbors. He asked for no help. He ate alone and slept alone and rose before the dark had lifted and worked until it fell again. He had thought this was surviving. He understood now it was something smaller. Ruth Calloway had moved to the Pendleton place in the autumn of the year 3 winters back. He had noticed her the way you notice a new fence post on a familiar road, orientation without attention. Widow, he'd heard, starting over. He had thought nothing further. He did not think further about most things that did not require a decision from him. And yet she had seen something. She had looked at his house, at the dark windows and the solitary smoke from the chimney and the absence of anything left on the porch for him to find, and she had decided, without being asked and without expectation, to begin. To wrap breading cloth and walk 2 miles in the dark before sunrise and set it on the railing and walk home again. To do this for 3 winters without a word of acknowledgment from him. He had not been cruel. He knew that, but he was beginning to understand that not cruel and not present were 2 different kinds of failure, and the second kind was quieter and lasted longer and was harder to face because it wore the face of minding your own business. He blew out the lamp. In the dark, he sat with his hands flat on the table and made a decision that had no language yet, only direction. East, 2 miles. The Pendleton place, before she settled so completely into her sensible, new life that his arriving would only be a disturbance. The loneliest kind of man isn't the one with nobody. It's the one who had somebody and just didn't look up. He had looked up. Late, too late perhaps, but he had looked. Her porch looked like his. Same weathered boards, same pale sky overhead. Same cold that came off the plains and found every gap in a coat. He stood on it on a Tuesday morning with nothing in his hands and no prepared words and understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that he had arrived at a place he had passed by every week for 3 years and never once stopped at. She was not there. He had known she would not be. She boarded in Harlan through the week. Ben Holt had said He was not sure what he had intended. He stood on her porch anyway, the way you stand at a place that means something even when the person isn't in it. He looked at what she had left behind. The kitchen garden along the south wall was banked with straw and burlap, each plant tended to, the kind of careful winterizing that took an afternoon and knew what it was doing. The firewood was stacked under the overhang in a column tight enough that no snow had gotten into it, the rounds sorted by size, the splitting clean. A small earthenware pot of what looked like sage had been moved into the angle of the overhang where the roofline kept the worst of the cold off it. He stood looking at the pot for a moment. These were the details of a woman who planned ahead, who paid attention, who intended to be somewhere for a long time and arranged her life accordingly. She had been arranging her life here, tending and stacking and protecting small growing things, and at some point, after 3 winters of walking 2 miles before dawn to leave bread for a man who never came to the door, she had made a different arrangement. He rode home without leaving anything. He had nothing to leave. That absence rode back with him and sat down at his table. At his own porch, he stopped and put his hand on the railing, on the worn groove where her hands had rested all those mornings. He stood like that for a moment, his palm fitted to the shape her patience had made in the wood. 3 years, he said to his horse, still at the hitching post. 3 years, and I never once thought to ask her name. The horse moved one ear back and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. Showing up late is still showing up, unless the door has already been locked from the inside. He did not know yet which kind of late this was. She opened the door before he had finished knocking. Saturday morning, thin winter sun, bare cottonwood shadows lying long across her front yard. He had ridden over. He would admit later, only to himself, that he had ridden past once on Friday evening to see if she had returned. And she had. Lamplight in the kitchen window, smoke from the chimney, a lantern moving past the glass. He came back Saturday and knocked, and she opened the door with the particular expression of a woman who had decided in advance how much of herself this conversation would receive. Not warm, not cold, measured. He took his hat off. He had rehearsed something on the ride over, and it was gone now, every word of it, and what remained was only what was true. I didn't know your name until last week, he said. She looked at him with those careful eyes. I know, she said. 2 words that contained 3 winters without raising their voice. He stood in her doorway and tried to explain himself and found he could not. Not because there was no explanation, but because every explanation was also an excuse, and he was trying very hard not to use one. He told her he had been thinking. She did not tell him that was a start, or that it was too late, or anything that would have made the conversation easier. She waited with a patience that was not unkind, but would not substitute for honesty, and he stood in that patience and felt the full weight of what he had not done. Why did you start? He asked finally, leaving it. She was quiet, the real kind of quiet, not hesitation, but consideration. She looked past him briefly at the pale yard, then back at his face. You looked like you'd forgotten there was a point to mourning, she said. He did not answer. There was no answer that would not have been insufficient. I was getting my own bread anyway, she said, and her voice was measured still, practical, not offering it as sentiment. Didn't seem like a hardship to make extra. She was giving him the smallest version of the truth. He understood that. The smallest version was still enough to stand him in place for a moment. I should have, he began. Yes, she said simply. He put his hat back on. He said he would let her get on with her Saturday. She said she appreciated that. He walked to his horse and she closed the door behind him. Not a slam, not a dismissal. A door closed with dignity by a woman who had learned not to leave them open too long. Some folks feed stray dogs for years before the dog remembers it was ever a dog. He rode home knowing something had cracked open that would not close again. Marin Price found Ruth at the Harlan Dry Goods on Thursday afternoon. Ruth was pricing fabric. a practical dark blue wool that would see her through 2 more winters, when Marin appeared at her elbow with the specific energy of a woman delivering news she had convinced herself was kindness. She was not alone. Judith Carey from the church committee was with her, and between the two of them they managed, over the course of a bolt of fabric and a spool of thread, to say most of what they had come to say. Gideon Hale was a good man, they agreed. A decent man, but some men were made a certain way and had been that way too long for it to shift. Ruth had made a sensible new start. She had good work in Harlan now, steady and respectable. Practical women, Marin said, with a warmth did not quite cover the instruction beneath it, didn't go backward. Ruth folded the fabric and set it on the counter. She thanked them. She bought the thread. She walked to the boarding house in the thin Harlan, cold, and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the floor. She had not been expecting to feel doubt. She had made her peace. She had not been waiting for Gideon Hale. She had simply stopped waiting, which was different, and she had thought the difference was enough. But doubt was not about what she wanted. Doubt was about what it would cost to want it again. On Sunday after service, Walt Price fell into step beside Gideon on the church steps. Walt was a reasonable man who said what he meant without decoration. He said that Gideon had always been well regarded in the county, that no one thought less of him for anything. He said that some women moved on clean, and a man could do them a kindness by letting it stay that way. Gideon shook the hand that was offered. He rode home in silence on a road that looked the same as every road he had ridden for 9 years. He recognized what Walt had given him. An exit, dressed as courtesy, lined with genuine goodwill, requiring nothing of him except a decision to stop. It would have been easy. The county would have understood. Ruth Calloway would have gone on with her sensible life, and he with his, and by spring the whole thing would have settled back to flat. Pride's the cheapest fence a man can build, and the hardest one to climb back over. He had been living behind that fence for 9 years. He knew exactly the shape of it from the inside. He stood at the back door in the dark with his hand on the railing. Not the middle of the railing, the near edge, the worn side. He could feel the groove under his palm, the specific smoothness that patience makes when it is applied to the same place, with the same care, for long enough. He stood there and let the cold come in around him and thought about nothing for a while, which was its own kind of thinking. He thought about Della. Not the locked grief he usually carried when her name surfaced, the sealed-over kind, the kind that had no room in it for anything to move. He thought about her the way you think about someone when the worst of the ache has softened enough to let other things in. She had been a woman who left lamps burning, who kept the coffee hot past the hour when anyone reasonable was still awake, who would have, he understood now, done exactly what Ruth Calloway had done, walked out in the dark and left something on a neighbor's porch and asked nothing for it. She would have told him to look up. She would have told him a long time ago. He went inside. He stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the flour sack on the shelf and the salt box beside it. He had bought both without purpose, kept them as his mother had kept them, out of the habit of stocking a kitchen that fed more than one. They had fed only him for 9 years. He did not know how to make bread. He had watched it done, but never done it himself. He pulled the flour sack down anyway, found a bowl, found water. The fire in the stove was low, and he built it up. He worked slowly, measuring the way he had seen measured, by approximation and feel, and the dough he produced was too dense and not quite right, and he knew it was not right and kept going anyway. He worked through the middle of the night with the fire and the imperfect dough and the silence of the ranch around him, and he did not think about whether it was enough or too late, or what her answer would be. Those were not the questions for tonight. Tonight the question was only whether he could manage to make something, badly, imperfectly, in the one vocabulary available to him that meant, I understand now what you were doing. I understand what it cost you, and I am only beginning to understand what it means. 3 years she stood in the cold, he said to no one, shaping the loaf. Least you can do is stand in a kitchen one night. The loaf came out slightly burned on the bottom, dense and dark and imperfect. He wrapped it in cloth the way hers had always been wrapped, with the knot tied carefully. He put on his coat. He sat by the stove until the sky began to gray. A loaf on the porch before sunrise means more than a sermon before noon. When the light came, he walked east, 2 miles in cold air before dawn. He had chosen to walk rather than ride, and he could not have explained the choice except that riding felt like speed, and speed felt like urgency, and he had used up whatever right he had to urgency. He walked at the pace of a man who understands that arriving too quickly would be its own kind of discourtesy. The road was hard frozen, and the fields on either side held the flat gray of earliest morning, the hour before color returns to the world, when everything is outlined in shadow and the breath comes out white and is taken back by the cold. He carried the loaf in both hands, wrapped in cloth, the bottom slightly warmer than the air around it. He had checked it 3 times before leaving the house. It was not good. That was not the point of it. Her gate was open. The yard was quiet. Smoke already rising from the chimney. She was awake, had been awake, was perhaps also the kind of person who rose before the light arrived and stood in her kitchen in the early silence doing the thinking that daylight made harder. He knocked on her front door. He heard movement inside, not the slow movement of someone woken, but the quick, certain movement of someone already present and organized. The door opened. She was in her coat over her dress, as though she had heard boots on the frozen path and come to the door before he reached it. She looked at him. Then she looked at what he held. He was holding the loaf in both hands, the cloth slightly uneven where he had tied it, the shape not quite regular. She looked at it for a long moment. He watched something move through her face, not amusement, though it was close to the edge of that. Not pity, something more serious and more specific, recognition. The recognition of a person who has been seen. "It's not as good as yours," he said. His voice was steady. He had not expected it to be steady, but it was. "I don't think anything I bring you will be. But I'd like to start." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the loaf and then at his face, and whatever she was looking for in his face, she looked for it fully, with the complete attention of a woman deciding something that mattered to her long term and would not be undecided easily. The cold stood between them. The sky above the yard was lightening from gray to the first thin suggestion of blue. She stepped back from the door. Not a word, just the open doorway, and the warmth of the kitchen coming through it, and the space made for him to enter. He stepped across the threshold. Out west, a man learns fast that the cold doesn't kill you. It's the silence that does. He had been silent for 9 years. He was done with it. Her kitchen table had 2 cups on it. He noticed that before anything else, 2 cups already set, steam rising from both. She had put the second one there before he knocked. He did not know when she had decided to do that. He did not ask. He sat where she indicated, across from where she would sit, and wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it move up through his palms. She sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said the hard things and are now in the ordinary space on the other side of them. They talked about the garden. She said the sage was doing better than she'd expected under the overhang. The cold had been dry rather than wet, which helped. He said the creek on his west boundary had frozen solid in the 2nd week of January and was only now beginning to show open water in the mornings. She asked if he'd lost any cattle to the cold. He said 2 calves early on, before he'd gotten the shelter sorted. She nodded. Losses like that had a particular weight, and she received the information accordingly, without diminishing it. She cut the loaf. She set her knife down and cut 2 slices and put one in front of him and kept one for herself. He watched her take a bite. She chewed. She looked at the table while she thought about it. "It's not bad," she said. "It's terrible," he said. She looked up at him, and there was something small and undefended in her voice when she said, "No, it's not." He understood that she was not talking about the bread. He did not say so. He ate his slice, and she ate hers, and the fire in the stove put its warmth into the room, and the morning light came through the window in the pale, slow way of February mornings, unhurried, spreading across the table between them. He did not stay long. Perhaps an hour. They did not make promises or declarations or plans that extended past the immediate present. He said he appreciated the coffee. She said the roads would be better by midweek if the temperature held. He agreed that it would likely hold. When he rose to go, she did not ask him to stay. He did not ask permission to return. Both of these things existed in the air between them as settled questions that required no language. He walked the 2 miles home in the same cold, pale morning light he had walked through to get there. The same fields, the same frozen road, the same color of sky. All of it identical to every February morning he had walked or ridden through for 12 years. Except that he was looking at it. At her gate, he turned once and looked back. She was standing in her open doorway, both hands loose at her sides, no coat now, the warmth of the kitchen at her back. She raised one hand briefly and let it fall. He lifted his chin in return. He walked on. Her porch railing, as he had last seen it, empty. But the right kind of empty now. Not the absence that has no answer. The absence that does. Spring don't announce itself. It just shows up one morning and the frost is gone. The frost was not gone yet. But the morning had a different quality to it. He felt it through his coat, not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of warmth, the memory of warmth, the promise that warmth had always made and always kept, every year since the first year, and would keep again. He walked home to his own porch. He did not look at the railing as he passed it. He went inside and put the coffee on and sat at his table, and for the first time in 9 years the empty chair across from him did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning that had been waiting quietly for a man to learn how to show up for it. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes, dedicated to everyone who left something on someone's porch in the cold, and the ones who finally imperfectly found their way to the door